The first carved bird appeared on Birdie Lawson's doorstep on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1883, and she almost stepped on it in the gray pre-dawn dark when she went to fetch her water pail. She caught herself just in time, her boot heel stopping a half-inch short of the tiny wooden figure, and she crouched down to pick it up with the kind of careful reverence a person reserves for things they do not yet understand. It was small enough to rest in the cup of her palm, carved from what she would later learn was cedar wood, and it was shaped like a meadowlark mid-song, its beak open, its wings slightly lifted as though it had just decided to take flight and had not yet committed to the decision. The detail was extraordinary. Every feather was individually suggested by the smallest of cuts. The eye was a precise dark bead pressed into the wood, and the feet were so delicate she could not fathom how a human hand had managed them without snapping them off. She turned it over. There was no name scratched into the base. There was no note folded beneath it. There was nothing but the bird itself, and the cool October air of Caldwell, Kansas pressing against her face. Birdie straightened up and looked down the length of Main Street, which was still mostly dark and mostly quiet, a dog sleeping against the wall of the feed store, a single lamp burning in the window of the telegraph office where old Amos Teeter kept his odd hours. There was no figure retreating into the shadows, no horse disappearing around a corner. Whoever had left the bird was already gone. She carried it inside and set it on the windowsill above her kitchen basin, where the early light would catch it, and she told herself she would think about it later. She had bread to bake and a shop to open. Birdie Lawson was 26 years old and had been running the Lawson Dry Goods and Sundries store since her father, Clement Lawson, had passed away from a fever 2 winters prior. She was not tall, but she carried herself as though she were, with a straight spine and a level gaze that had discouraged more than one difficult customer from pushing his luck. Her hair was the color of dark honey, and she wore it pinned up with a practicality that occasionally, in the evenings when she let it down, surprised even herself with how much of it there was. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was simply busy, and busyness had served as a reasonable substitute for happiness for long enough that she had stopped noticing the difference. Caldwell in 1883 was a town still figuring out what it wanted to be. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, and the cattle drive still came through, though not with the ferocity they had in the earlier years of the decade. The cowboys rode in dusty and loud, and spent their wages with the kind of enthusiasm that kept places like Birdie's store and the 2 saloons and the hotel in reasonable business. There was a new school going up on the edge of town, a barber shop that had added a bathing room in the back, and a church whose congregation was split roughly down the middle between those who wanted a stained glass window and those who thought that was prideful and wasteful. Birdie knew everyone, and everyone knew her, and the steady commerce of small-town life was something she navigated the way a good rider navigates familiar terrain, without having to think too hard about it. The second bird appeared on Wednesday morning. This one was a sparrow, and it was perched on what appeared to be a tiny section of fence rail, its head turned to one side with such perfectly observed curiosity that Birdie laughed out loud when she picked it up, which startled her because she had not expected to laugh. She carried it inside and set it beside the meadowlark on the windowsill, and this time she stood at her door for a full minute looking up and down the street before she went in. Still nobody. Still nothing. She asked casually, when the widow Carla Hatch came in for her weekly flour and salt, whether Carla had noticed anyone near the store in the early morning hours. Carla, who was constitutionally incapable of withholding information, said she had not, but immediately wanted to know why, and Birdie said it was nothing, just that she had thought she heard something, and Carla accepted this with the mild disappointment of a woman who had hoped for something more interesting. By Thursday, when the third bird appeared, a tiny owl this time, its round eyes giving it an expression of solemn and slightly offended dignity, Birdie had begun to look forward to the moment she opened her door each morning. She would not have admitted this to anyone. She told herself she was simply curious, which was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that someone in Caldwell, Kansas was waking before dawn every single morning and carving a bird from wood and leaving it on her doorstep, and they were doing it with a skill and a care that spoke of long practice and genuine feeling, and nobody in the world had ever done anything remotely like that for Birdie Lawson, and it made something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tightened. The fourth bird was a heron, long-legged and elegant, balanced on one foot. The fifth was a robin. The sixth was a quail, and this one made her breath catch because the quail's little topknot was rendered with such meticulous attention that she could count the individual feathers that made it up. 7, 8, 9. A wood thrush, a swift, a tanager with wings spread and tail fanned. They lined up along her windowsill in a row, and in the mornings when the light came in from the east and hit them at the low angle of autumn sun, they threw such warm shadows across her kitchen wall that the room felt inhabited in a way it had not felt since her father was alive. She asked around, carefully, without revealing what she was asking about. She mentioned to Pete Garland at the livery that she had found some carved woodwork and wondered who in town did that kind of work. Pete thought about it and said old Mr. Fenway had done some whittling, but he had bad arthritis now and could barely hold a knife. She thanked him and moved on. She asked the barber, Ned Sloan, who knew everything that could be known about the men of Caldwell, whether anyone had a reputation for fine wood carving. Ned stroked his jaw and said there was a fellow out at the Rafter T ranch who made his own furniture, but that was just boards and nails, nothing fancy. She thanked him and moved on. She asked Reverend Cotton, whose congregation provided him with excellent intelligence about the town, and the Reverend said he believed there had been a German immigrant in Abilene some years back who did decorative carving, but he had moved on to Colorado if he recalled correctly. Nobody knew. The 10th bird was a cardinal, and the red paint on its chest, someone had actually painted it. A thin, precise wash of crimson was so vivid against the pale cedar that Birdie stood in her doorway for a long moment just looking at it before she could bring herself to pick it up. It was that morning, the morning of the cardinal, that she first really looked at Homer Haskins. He was not new to Caldwell. He had come to town in the spring as a hand on the Rafter T, one of several men taken on for the season, and she had sold him rope and tinned goods, and a new hat on at least 3 separate occasions without taking particular note of him beyond the ordinary courtesies of commerce. He was 30 years old, lean and sun-darkened in the way of men who worked outside, with brown hair that wanted cutting, and a jaw that was always in some intermediate stage between clean-shaven and bearded. He had gray eyes that were thoughtful in a way that was slightly unusual for a cowboy, which was not a profession that rewarded thoughtfulness with anything except sore knees and low wages, and he had large, careful hands. She noticed the hands that morning because she was looking at the cardinal and thinking about the hands that had made all these birds, and Homer Haskins came through her door at 8 in the morning for salt pork and hardtack, and she happened to glance at his hands when he counted out his coins on her counter, and she saw that the tips of his fingers, all the way to the knuckles, had the small, careful cuts and calluses of a man who worked with a blade in a different way than cowboys usually did. A cowboy's hands had rope burns and boot leather stiffness. These hands had something finer on them. The cuts were precise and small, and in the places where a carving knife's edge would find skin when the wood did not go the direction you expected. She looked up at his face and found him looking at the windowsill behind her, at the row of birds in their morning light. Something moved across his expression. It was quick and quiet, and he covered it immediately, but she saw it. It was the expression of a man who sees something he made and is trying very hard not to let on that he knows it. She said nothing. She counted his change back to him and thanked him, and he touched the brim of his hat and went out, and she stood very still behind her counter with her heart beating in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the transaction that had just occurred. She thought about it all day. She arranged the bolts of fabric on their shelf and thought about it. She weighed out sugar for Mrs. Delancey and thought about it. She swept the floor in the late afternoon with the low amber light coming in the window and laying itself across the birds on the sill, and she thought about it and thought about it and arrived at the following conclusion. She was not going to say anything yet. She was not sure exactly why. Part of it was that she might be wrong, though she did not really believe she was wrong. Part of it was that the birds were arriving every morning and she did not want them to stop, and if she confronted him and he denied it or became uncomfortable, they might stop, and she was not ready for them to stop. But the larger part of it, the part she was least comfortable examining, was that she wanted to understand what kind of man spent his mornings carving birds for a woman he had barely spoken to, and she suspected the only way to understand that was to let it continue until some natural moment of revelation arrived. So she watched him. It was not difficult. Caldwell was not a large town, and the Rafter T cowboys came in with some regularity, and Homer Haskins came in more regularly than most because, she began to notice, he came in slightly more often than any man could justifiably need salt pork and hardtack and rope. He came in and he bought small necessary things, and he stood at her counter, and he did not look at the birds on the windowsill after that first morning, which told her as clearly as any confession that he knew exactly what they were and where they had come from, and that he was working very hard at a performance of ignorance. She began to take more care in her own performance in return. She began to actually talk to him. She asked him where he was from, the way she asked anyone where they were from, in the natural course of wrapping purchases in brown paper and making the small change that oiled the wheels of commerce. He was from Missouri, he said, a small town near the Ozarks. She said she had never been to Missouri. He said there was not a great deal in Missouri to recommend a special journey, though the rivers were fine and the hills in the fall were the kind of thing that made a person understand why people wrote poetry. And then he looked slightly embarrassed about having said this, as though the mention of poetry was more of himself than he had intended to give. She thought that was interesting. She tucked it away. She asked him the next time he came in whether he had any family back in Missouri. He said his mother was still alive and well in the town he had grown up in, and that he had 2 sisters, both married, and a younger brother who had gone to work on the railroad out west. She said that sounded like a good family. He said it was. He said he wrote to his mother every 2 weeks without fail, which she also thought was interesting, and she tucked that away too. The 11th bird was a swallow built for speed, its wings swept back in a posture of pure momentum. The 12th was a mockingbird. The 13th was a blue jay, small and imperious, and this one had a tiny detail she did not notice until she had been staring at it for several minutes on the windowsill. Carved into the underside of the base, nearly invisible unless you held it in the light at just the right angle, were 2 letters. Not initials, not a name. Just 2 letters. H and L, H and L. She held the blue jay for a long time in her 2 hands and felt her heart do something complicated inside her chest. H and L, Homer and Lawson, or Haskins and Lawson, or any combination thereof. The pairing felt deliberate. It felt like someone who had been leaving birds on a doorstep for nearly 2 weeks had reached the point where they needed to put something of themselves into the work, even if it was small and hidden and only findable by a person looking very carefully. She went that afternoon, between the slow hours of 2 and 4 when the store was quiet, and she took down every bird from the windowsill and turned each one over and held it in the proper light. She had to squint at some of them. But she found it on all of them, going back to the very first meadowlark, the same 2 letters pressed into the wood with such delicacy that she had simply never thought to look. H and L. He had been signing them from the beginning. She put them all back, and she stood at her window looking out at the street, and she thought about Homer Haskins with his thoughtful gray eyes and his careful hands, and his embarrassment about mentioning poetry. And she thought that she had been alone for 2 years, and that loneliness was a cold and enduring thing. And she thought that a man who woke before dawn to carve small, perfect birds for a woman he barely knew was either entirely foolish or entirely sincere, and she was increasingly certain it was the latter. She decided the next morning she would ask. The 14th bird appeared in the dark of the pre-dawn as always. She had been awake for an hour before it arrived, lying in her bed listening to the silence of the town and the occasional voice of the wind along the eaves, and she heard nothing, no footstep, no sound of movement. And yet when she opened her door in the gray just before sunrise, there it was. A wren, tiny as a thought, wings folded, hunkered down in the particular posture wrens have that makes them look as though they are stubbornly refusing to be moved by anything the world might throw at them. She picked it up and held it and felt something in her throat tighten. Then she heard the horse. She looked up and down the street and she saw him. Homer Haskins was perhaps 50 yards away, walking his horse slowly northward, already on his way back to the Rafter T, or appearing to be. But he had not yet gone around the bend, and she was standing in her doorway, and when he turned his head, whether from habit or some involuntary compulsion, she would never know for certain he saw her there. They looked at each other for a moment across the 50 yards of empty Morning Street, and then he raised his hand in a brief, startled, hopeless sort of acknowledgement, and she raised the wren in her hand toward him, and neither of them said anything. And then he nudged his horse and walked it away around the corner, and she stood there in the doorway with the wren in her palm and the autumn air on her face, and she knew that the performance was over. She thought about it all day with a different quality of thinking than she had used before. Before, she had been puzzling something out. Now she was preparing. She had arrived at a certainty she had not had before, which was not the certainty of romantic confidence. She was not particularly confident in that direction, but rather the certainty of a woman who has observed something carefully for long enough to understand its nature. And what she understood was that whatever Homer Haskins felt for her had been building since before he had put knife to wood, and that the birds were not the beginning of the feeling but only its expression. And that a man who expressed himself this way was the kind of man worth knowing better. She also understood that he was not going to speak first. This was abundantly clear. He would carve birds until the snow came and then probably switch to leaving them inside small covered boxes or something similarly resourceful, because he did not seem like the kind of man who quit but he would not speak first. He was too careful for that. He was too aware of the risk of rejection, or perhaps too afraid of disturbing whatever this thing was, the same way she had been afraid of disturbing it. One of them had to go first. It would be her. She was not a woman who shied away from a thing once she had decided on it, and so she waited until the following morning, which was the morning of the 15th bird. A mourning dove, naturally, as though the cedar had a sense of irony. And then she walked out of her store at 9 o'clock, told the hatch boy she would be back in an hour, and he was to mind the counter and not give anyone credit she hadn't already approved. And she walked to the livery stable at the end of town and hired a horse and rode out to the Rafter T. The Rafter T was a working cattle operation run by a man named Cal Trevors, who was decent enough and paid his hands on time, and asked less of them in terms of personality than most employers did. The spread was 4 miles out of town, and it was a fine morning for a ride, the air cool and clean with the smell of dry grass and juniper, the sky the particular sharp blue that Kansas put on in October like its good dress. She arrived at the ranch yard while the hands were coming in from the morning work, dusty and hungry, and moving toward the cook's fire with the purposeful resignation of men who have learned not to let hunger cloud their efficiency. She spotted Homer Haskins among them. He was talking to another hand, laughing at something, and then he looked up and saw her sitting on her hired horse in the middle of his employer's yard, and the laugh stopped and his expression became something she could not quite name. Startled, certainly. Something else beneath that. Something less controlled. She dismounted before he could reach her because she wanted to be on her feet for this conversation and not look down at him from horseback. He came toward her at a deliberate walk, pulling off his work gloves and folding them into his belt, and several of the other hands had noticed her and were watching with the unashamed curiosity of men with limited entertainment options, and she did not care about that at all. He stopped in front of her. He said her name. He said, "Miss Lawson." She said, "Who made them?" She watched the question land on him. She watched him consider several things in rapid succession: denial, deflection, confession, flight. She watched him choose. He said, "I did." She said, "All 14 of them." He said, 15. She looked at him. He said, "The dove this morning, that is 15. She felt the corner of her mouth move before she could stop it. She said, 15. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. The other hands had the grace to pretend they were not listening, which meant they were listening very intently indeed. He looked out over her shoulder at the flat, dry country and the blue sky, and then he looked back at her and said, "Because you are named Birdie and I could think of no better way to say what I wanted to say." She said, "What did you want to say?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "That I have thought about you every day since I first came into your store in March, and I have not known what to do about that, and the birds were the best I could manage." Something in Birdie Lawson's chest, the tight thing, the 2-year-old thing, moved. She said, "You could have introduced yourself properly." He said, "I know. I am aware that is the sensible approach. I'm apparently not always sensible." She said, "No, apparently not." She paused. She looked at him, at his gray eyes and his careful hands and the way he was holding himself with the careful, controlled stillness of a man who is waiting for a verdict and is not sure it will go his way. She said, "The birds are extraordinary, every one of them." Something shifted in his face. He said, "You looked at them." She said, "Every morning they are on my windowsill, all of them." He said very quietly, "I hoped they might be." She said, "I found the letters on the bottoms, H and L." His jaw moved. He nodded. She said, "Homer." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am going to be direct with you because I find that is generally the most efficient approach. I think you are an interesting man, and I would like to know you better in a conventional manner, which means that instead of leaving birds on my doorstep in the dark before dawn, you could come to the store during business hours and talk to me, and perhaps when you next have a free Sunday, you could call on me like a proper person." He stared at her for a moment, and then he said with the very faintest ghost of a smile, "I could do that." She said, "Good." She turned and remounted her horse with the ease of a woman who had grown up riding. She turned the horse toward town and then paused and looked back at him. She said, "Though I would not object to one more bird, if you happen to have one ready." He said, "I might have one or two that are nearly finished." She said, in a tone that was not entirely discouraging, and rode back toward Caldwell. She was very nearly smiling the entire way. That Sunday he came to her door at 2 in the afternoon, which was the hour she had told him was acceptable, wearing a clean shirt and his better hat, and carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She opened the door before he knocked because she had been watching the street for the past quarter hour with considerably more investment than she would have liked to admit, and she invited him in and put the kettle on because she had a small iron stove, and she had managed to acquire coffee, which was still not always easily come by, and they sat at her kitchen table with the 15 birds on the windowsill catching the afternoon light. He unwrapped the bundle. It contained 2 more birds, nearly finished as he had said. One was a lark bunting, which was the state bird of Colorado, and one was another meadowlark, which was the first bird he had left, a fact he did not explain but that she felt he intended as a kind of bookend. She held them and examined them with the close attention she had applied to all the others. She said, "How did you learn to do this?" He said his grandfather had taught him. A man named Elias Haskins, who had come over from Germany in the 1840s and had worked as a cabinet maker, and had believed that the discipline of fine work with wood was the nearest thing to a religion that he had personally been able to get behind. He had taught Homer when Homer was 6 years old, sitting him at a work table and putting a piece of soft pine in his hands, and showing him how to read the grain, how the blade should follow the intention of the wood rather than fighting it, how patience was not a virtue you needed to summon but a skill you practiced until it became natural. She listened to him talk about his grandfather and felt herself lean forward slightly in her chair without intending to, drawn by the way he spoke about the old man, with a quiet reverence that was also full of humor and specific detail, the way people speak about someone they loved genuinely and miss genuinely. She told him about her own father. She told him about Clement Lawson, who had built the store from nothing in 1871 and had raised Birdie and her brother Eli above it, and who had believed that a fair price and a straight answer were the foundations of any decent enterprise. She told him Eli had gone to work as a surveyor out west and sent letters at irregular intervals, and that since her father had died, she had run the store herself with some help from the hatch boy during busy seasons. He listened the way he did most things, with that particular quality of attention that felt like it cost him something, like he was genuinely spending himself on what she was saying and not just waiting for his turn. They talked for 3 hours. They barely noticed the time until the light in the room had shifted from afternoon gold to the bluish gray of early evening, and she looked at the window and was genuinely surprised. He stood up to leave with a natural reluctance that he managed to keep dignified, and at the door he said, "Next Sunday," she said. "Yes." He said, "Is there anything you need from the store this week? I could bring something." She looked at him steadily. She said, "You do not need a reason to come to the store, Homer. You can just come." The name, his first name, sat in the air between them for a moment. He had not asked her to use it. She had simply used it, and they both felt the significance of that. He said, "All right." He put on his hat. He said, "Birdie." He walked down the street in the blue-gray evening, and she watched him go from her doorway and did not go inside until he had turned the corner. The following weeks had a quality about them that Birdie would later struggle to describe accurately to anyone who asked her about it, which was that everything in her daily life remained exactly the same: the store, the customers, the baking, the bookkeeping, the minor dramas of small-town commerce. And yet everything felt slightly different, as though someone had adjusted the light. She noticed this without quite understanding it, because she was a practical woman, and practical women are sometimes the last to recognize joy when it is happening to them. Homer came to the store on Tuesday and bought rope he absolutely did not need, and they talked for 20 minutes about the question of whether Caldwell should build a second school on the south side of town, which was a genuine local controversy. He had opinions about it that were sensible and carefully thought out, and she disagreed with part of what he said and told him so, and he listened to her objection and modified his position slightly, which she found more attractive than if he had simply agreed with her. He came on Thursday, and she was in the middle of a complicated situation involving a rancher named Desmond Cole, who was disputing an invoice from 2 months ago, and Homer sat in the corner on the barrel she kept there for people waiting, and he did not say a word or offer to help, because he could tell she did not want help. She wanted the transaction handled correctly on her own terms, and when Desmond Cole finally left somewhat grudgingly with the original invoice confirmed, Homer said, "You are quite formidable," and she said, "Yes," without any false modesty whatsoever. Sunday came again. This time he brought her a book he had borrowed from the small lending collection that the schoolteacher Mrs. Prentice kept in the school building. It was a collection of poems by Emily Dickinson, published just a couple of years before, and she said, "You mentioned poetry," and he said he had thought she might like Dickinson, who had been interested in birds in her writing. She took the book and opened it at random and read the first poem her eye landed on, which was about the way hope was a thing with feathers, and she looked up at him with an expression she did not try to conceal, and he looked back at her with the gray eyes that were thoughtful and careful, and also, she was beginning to understand, full of a warmth he did not often allow into the open air. She said, "You are a surprising person, Homer Haskins." He said, "Is that good?" She said, "In my experience, surprising is usually good unless it involves snakes." He laughed, a real laugh, and it transformed his face in a way that made her want very much to be the reason for it as often as possible. The Sundays stacked up. 4 of them, then 5, and in between the Sundays there were the Tuesday and Thursday visits to the store, and occasionally a walk in the evening when the weather was still decent enough, down along the creek that ran south of town, where the cottonwoods were going yellow and shedding their leaves into the water. She told him about the injustice of how the territory lands were still being taken from the Comanche and the other Plains peoples, the way the promises made in treaties were broken as systematically, as if breaking them were government policy, which it was, and she said it was something that troubled her, and that she believed people ought to name directly rather than look away from. He agreed with her without qualification, which was not always the reaction she got from people, and he said his grandfather, the German who had come over seeking liberty, had said that a country that called itself free while building itself on the dispossession of others was always in some stage of unfinished argument with itself, and that the argument would not be resolved cheaply. She filed this away with everything else she was learning about him, which was becoming a significant archive. He told her about the cattle drives he had worked on the years before Caldwell, following the Kisham Trail from Texas, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from weeks in the saddle, the strange community of a drive crew, the way the prairie at night with 10,000 stars, and the sound of the herd settling is both completely lonely and not lonely at all. He told her about a bad winter in Wyoming 2 years back when he had gotten caught in a blizzard with 2 other men, and they had sheltered 3 days in a half-collapsed line shack, and he had carved a horse during those 3 days from a piece of pine board he found in the shack's wall, just to have something to do with his hands. She said, "Do you still have it?" He said yes, it was in his bedroll at the bunkhouse. She said, "I would like to see it." He said, "It is not very good." "It was cold and my hands were stiff," she said. "I would still like to see it." He brought it the next Tuesday. It was cruder than the birds, as he had warned, the legs too thick and the mane suggested rather than detailed, but there was something in it that she recognized as the same intelligence that was in the birds, the same sense of trying to catch a living thing in the moment of its particular life. She said, "This is good." He looked at the horse in her hands and said, with a kind of careful honesty, "It got me through 3 days." She understood this in a way that went beyond the words. She set the horse on the windowsill beside the birds and said, "Then it belongs here." He looked at the windowsill with all the carved things on it, and she watched something in his face go quiet and open the way it did sometimes when he was moved, and was not trying to hide it. It was November now, and the weather had turned mean with a cold, wet wind that came down from the north, and the cattle drives had stopped for the season, and several of the Rafter T hands had already been let go until spring. She had been aware of this and had been waiting for what she expected would be the conversation about it, and it came on a Thursday in the 2nd week of November. He said Cal Trevors was keeping on 4 hands through the winter but had let 6 go. Homer was one of the 4 kept on, which was a reasonable testament to his usefulness, but it also meant he would be on a reduced wage and working through cold months with less to do and more time to think. She said, "I have been thinking." He looked at her. She said, "The Hatch boy is reliable, but he is 17 and not much use with numbers. I have been thinking that I could use someone with a proper head for accounts, at least through the winter when the trade is lighter and I could show them the books properly." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I do not have a great deal of experience with bookkeeping." She said, "You write to your mother every 2 weeks without fail, and your letters are, I imagine, coherent." He said, "They are," she said. "Then you can learn books. It is mostly just careful addition." There was a pause. He said, "Are you offering me a job?" She said, 2 days a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, help with the heavier stock and the accounts. I pay honestly and on time." He said, "I know you do." He thought about it, which she appreciated, because she would have trusted the judgment of a man who thought about things slightly less. Then he said, "Yes, I will." So he came on Wednesdays and Saturdays through November and December, and the arrangement was entirely professional in its stated terms, and entirely not professional in the way it actually felt. He restocked shelves and carried crates, and learned the accounts with a quickness that surprised him and did not surprise her, and they worked in the easy proximity of people who have become genuinely comfortable with each other. The other people of Caldwell noticed, of course. This was inevitable. Carla Hatch mentioned it to 3 separate people. The barber Ned Sloan referenced it obliquely to Homer when Homer came in for a shave. Even Reverend Cotton, who was generally discreet, asked Birdie after Sunday service whether she was well and whether there was anything the congregation could do for her, which was his particular way of indicating that the congregation was paying attention. Birdie did not mind the attention. She had lived in this town her whole life, and she understood that being observed was the price of belonging, and on balance, belonging was worth it. What she found she did mind, in a way she had not expected, was that the watching seemed to have a constraining effect on Homer, who became slightly more careful and slightly more formal in public than he was when they were alone in the store or walking by the creek. She addressed this on a Wednesday in early December when the snow had come and the store was quiet and warm from the stove, and they were sitting at the back counter going through the December invoices, and she noticed that he had moved his chair a half-inch farther from hers than it had been the previous Wednesday for no apparent reason. She said, "You are doing it again." He looked up from the invoice. He said, "What?" She said, "Making yourself smaller so that people will have less to remark upon." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I am aware that there are people who are watching," she said. "There are always people watching. In a town this size there are always people watching, and in my experience the most effective thing to do about it is to behave in the exact way you would behave if nobody were watching." He said, "That is a reasonable philosophy." She said, "The half-inch makes the invoices harder to read together." He moved his chair back to where it had been. She did not say anything more about it. He did not move the chair again after that. December deepened and Christmas came, and the town put on its modest festive effort, which included a service at the church and a small gathering at the hotel and strings of evergreen cut from the cedars along the creek and hung over doorways. Birdie decorated the store window with some of this, and with a small display of practical and semi-festive goods, and Homer helped her arrange it on a Saturday afternoon, climbing on a stool to hang the cedar and coming down to look at it critically from across the store, and then going back up to adjust it 3 times before she told him it was perfect and he should stop. He gave her a carved bird for Christmas. This one was different from all the others. It was a pair of birds, carved from a single piece of wood, a male and female cardinal sitting together on a branch, their bodies touching lightly at the shoulder in the particular way that cardinals sit. They were about 4 inches tall together, and the detail was the finest work she had yet seen from him, every feather individual, the curve of the branch natural and textured. He had painted the male red and left the female in the pale cedar, and together they made a thing of startling beauty. She held them for a long time. She said, "Homer." He said, "Yes." She said, "Come here." He came and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him. He was taller than her by a meaningful margin, and she said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "All right," she said. "I have been alone for 2 years, and I had gotten fairly well accustomed to it, which I now think is something that happens to people when they are afraid, because loneliness is at least predictable." He listened. She said, "You have made the last 2 months the most interesting and the most pleasant that I have had in a very long time, and I am not accustomed to saying things like that, so I will say it once plainly, and you can do with it what you like. I am glad the meadowlark was on my doorstep. I am glad you carved it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took both her hands in his, the paired cardinals between them, and he said, "I carved the first one because I did not know how else to begin. I kept carving them because every time I finished one I thought of another reason I wanted you to have it. And somewhere in the middle of all that I understood that what I was trying to say was that I thought you were the finest person I had come across in a long and not uninteresting life, and I did not know if that was the kind of thing a man ought to say to a woman he had barely spoken to, but I was hoping the birds might say it better than I could." She looked at his hands holding hers. She said, "They said it very well." He said very quietly, "And now," she said, "and now you might say the rest of it yourself, since you are apparently capable of words after all." He said, "Birdie Lawson, I love you." She felt those words go into her the way the first bird had gone into her hands on the cold October morning, with a kind of careful astonishment. She said, "I love you too, Homer Haskins." She said it plainly, the way she did everything. The way she ran her store and spoke her mind and held her ground with difficult ranchers. Plainly and without equivocation. He looked at her as though he was not entirely sure he had heard correctly, and then he smiled, a full smile, not the ghost of one that she had been collecting since October, and he squeezed her hands once and then said, "Good. That is very good." She laughed. She could not help it. She said, "You are absurd." He said, "Likely." He kissed her then, which was the first time, and it was brief and respectful and entirely right in the way that first kisses between people who have taken a long and careful road toward each other tend to be. The winter continued with its blue cold days and its early dark evenings, and things between Birdie and Homer settled into the shape of something real and enduring and also still exciting, which was the most fortunate combination. He came to work his 2 days a week, and he came on Sundays for supper because she had started cooking on Sundays, which was something she had not done much since her father was alive, and the kitchen had warmth in it again. He took her to the church social in January, which confirmed for the entire town what most of them had already suspected, and Carla Hatch said afterward to no fewer than 7 people that she had always known Birdie would end up with someone special, which was not entirely accurate, but was said with such genuine warmth that nobody disputed it. In February, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the store on a Wednesday, which was a choice that she would later appreciate more the longer she knew him, because it was the place where they had first really talked to each other, and he was the kind of man who understood the significance of places and of returning to them. He had not planned a ceremony about it. He simply set down the manifest he was checking and looked at her where she was measuring out dried beans for a customer order and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say I will not leave, and I will not be difficult about it." She set down the scoop. She looked at him. He said, "Will you marry me?" "I am not a wealthy man, and I do not know if I will ever be a wealthy man, but I work hard, and I will work hard for you and for whatever we build together, and I love you with everything I have, which I will admit is not always the tidiest of sentiments, but is entirely genuine." She said, "Yes." He said, "Just like that." She said, "Homer, I watched you leave birds on my doorstep for 14 mornings before I asked who made them. I have had plenty of time to think about this." He laughed his real laugh, and she came around the counter, and he held her, and she rested her forehead against his jaw, and they stood there in the warm, quiet store for a long moment. The wedding was in April, when the plains showed their spring face, which was brief and extravagant and full of color. The whole town came because Birdie had lived there her entire life, and the whole town considered her theirs in the affectionate proprietary way that small towns have about their own. Reverend Cotton performed the ceremony in the church that did not yet have its stained glass window. Carla Hatch cried. The Hatch boy, whose name was actually Jacob, stood very straight in the back as though trying to look older. Homer's mother, Homer Haskins, had come up from Missouri on the train, a small, vigorous woman of 62 who had her son's gray eyes and who took Birdie's hands when they met and said, "He has written to me about you since October. He has not written about anything else." Birdie thought this was possibly the most touching thing anyone had said to her in her entire life. Homer's younger brother Will had come from the railroad work, sunburned and loud and good-natured, and he stood up with Homer at the altar with the cheerful energy of a young man who thought his older brother had done extraordinarily well for himself. Birdie wore a dress she and Carla had made from the best fabric in the store, a pale blue that Carla insisted was exactly right, and that Homer, when he saw her come down the aisle of the church on the arm of the reverend's deacon since her father was gone, had the particular expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has just received his reward. They stood before Reverend Cott and exchanged their vows with the clear voices of people who mean what they are saying. And when the Reverend said Homer might kiss his bride, Homer cupped her face in his careful hands and kissed her with everyone watching, and she did not mind the watching even a little bit. Afterward there was food at the hotel dining room, which Mrs. Belmont the hotelier had arranged with great enthusiasm, and there was dancing to the fiddle of a man named Ike Prout, who could play 3 songs very well and everything else passably. Homer danced with her, and he was not the most graceful dancer she had ever seen, but he was attentive and willing and improved as the evening went on, and she thought that described him generally. They set up their life together above the store, in the rooms that had been her father's and then hers, and the rooms became theirs with very little drama and a great deal of contentment. He continued his work at the Rafter T 3 days a week through the spring and summer, because the income was useful, and he worked the store with her on the other days, and they fell into the rhythms of a shared life the way people do when the fit is genuine, not without adjustment and occasional friction, but with the fundamental ease that comes from 2 people who actually like each other as much as they love each other, which is not always the case and is worth noting when it is. The birds moved. She took them from the windowsill above the kitchen basin and arranged them on a small shelf he built for them in the sitting room, a proper shelf with little carved decorative touches on the brackets, because he could not make a functional object without also making it beautiful, which was a quality she had come to regard as one of his most characteristic. The cardinals sat in the center. The meadowlark was on the far left end, the first one, still as perfect as the day she had almost stepped on it in the gray October dark. He still carved. Winter evenings by the stove, or the occasional slow afternoon, he would sit with a piece of cedar or walnut or whatever wood he had come across and his small sharp knives, and he would work with the focused quietness that she had come to find as comfortable and companionable as conversation. He made her a bowl from walnut wood, perfectly round and smooth, that sat on the kitchen table and held whatever fruit was in season. He made the baby a cradle. The baby came in February of 1885. A boy, which Homer received with the speechless wonder of a man who had not entirely prepared himself for the reality of it despite 9 months of preparation. He was born on a Thursday in the upstairs room with Dr. Connell and Carla Hatch attending, and he was healthy and loud about it and had, right from the start, his father's gray eyes. They named him Clement for Birdie's father, and the name sat on the boy immediately as though it had been waiting for him. Homer held his son the first evening with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and Birdie, tired and newly peaceful in the way of women after labor, watched him and felt a fullness in her chest that she did not have words for, though she thought the words were probably superfluous by this point. Homer looked up and met her eyes and said, very quietly, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome," and meant it from somewhere deep. Little Clement proved to be a child of strong opinions from an early age. He walked at 10 months and ran almost immediately after, and by the time he was 2 he had views about what he would and would not eat and where he would and would not sit and who he would and would not be quiet for, which did not include many people but did include his father. The sight of Homer sitting down to carve in the evenings would stop Clement in whatever headlong enterprise he was pursuing, and bring him to sit beside his father with a watching quiet that was the most stillness he achieved in any given day. Homer began when Clement was 3 and old enough to be trusted with something small and not sharp, giving him little pieces of soft pine and showing him how to look at the grain, the same way his grandfather Elias had done for him on the other side of the world in another decade entirely. Birdie watched this from the kitchen doorway sometimes and felt the continuity of it, the way things passed from hand to hand across time. She wrote to Eli, her brother out west, about all of it. His letters back were fond and interested and always too short, and he always promised to visit and always found reasons not to quite yet, which was the particular limitation of a man with surveying contracts scattered across 3 territories. The store grew. Homer's involvement in the accounts had turned out, after his initial modesty about it, to be genuinely transformative. He had a mind for systems and for the logic of commerce, and by 1886 they had expanded the floor space by taking over the adjoining building that had housed a saddle repair shop, and the new stock included proper dry goods and an expanded hardware selection, and a small but well-chosen assortment of books, because Birdie had long believed that books were a necessity and not a luxury, and stocked them accordingly. The town grew too, as Kansas went on filling up with settlers and the railroad pushed further and brought more people with it. There were now 2 schools, which resolved the controversy the way most things do in small towns, by outgrowing the original argument. There was a proper doctor's office, not just Dr. Connell working out of his house. There was a bank, which Homer regarded with the reasonable suspicion of a man who had spent years in the outdoor economy of cattle and labor, and was not instinctively sure that giving your money to other people for safekeeping was an improvement over other arrangements, but he adapted. They had a second child in 1887. A girl this time, whom they named Eleanor after Homer's mother, which made Homer Haskins cry when they told her via letter, happy tears, the kind described with 3 exclamation marks in a woman who was not otherwise a woman of exclamation marks. Eleanor Ellie, from the start, was a different creature entirely from her brother, watchful and precise where Clement was immediate and loud, with her mother's dark honey hair, and a way of examining the world that Homer said reminded him of someone examining a piece of wood before you put the knife to it, trying to understand the grain before you committed. Birdie said that was the nicest thing anyone had ever compared her daughter to. Life in the years following had the texture of something well made. Not without difficulty. There were hard seasons. A drought in 1888 that stressed everyone and required careful management of the store's credit to neighbors who were short, which Birdie navigated with the combination of firmness and generosity that characterized all her dealings. There were illnesses. Clement down for 2 weeks with a bad chest one winter. Birdie herself laid low for 10 days with an influenza that Homer nursed with such comprehensive and attentive care that the other women of Caldwell, who heard about it through the inevitable channels, discussed it among themselves with the particular satisfaction of women who like to see a thing done right. There were the larger difficulties of the world coming in at the edges, the continued troubles on the plains, the economic pressures of the 1890s that would hit harder as the decade went on, the sense that the West was changing rapidly, and not always in ways that felt like progress for everyone. Birdie and Homer talked about these things in the evenings after the children were in bed, and they disagreed sometimes and agreed often, and always came back to the central fact of each other. Homer left the Rafter T permanently in 1888, when the cattle business contracted enough that Travers let all but 2 of his hands go. Homer was not one of the 2. He came home and told Birdie with the careful neutrality of a man trying not to appear as though this was more of a relief than a crisis, and she heard both things and said, "Good. You were never going to be a cattleman and now you don't have to pretend to be." He said, "That is a very direct thing to say." She said, "Your hands were meant for other things. Come and look at the store accounts. I want to talk about the proposal I have for expanding the book section." He came and looked and they talked, and within the year he was managing the store alongside her with the full weight of his attention and ability, and it was better in every way. He hired Jacob Hatch, now a grown and capable young man of 20, to help with the heavy work and the deliveries, and the store ran with a smoothness and a warmth that people remarked on, the way the best places always have an atmosphere that is partly commerce and partly something else, the spirit of the people who run it. He carved in the evening still, and occasionally took commissions from people who had seen the work and wanted something particular. He made a pair of horses for the schoolteacher Mrs. Prentice, which she put on her desk, and which every child in Caldwell for years afterward would handle and examine with reverent curiosity. He made a full nativity set that the church used every Christmas, and the figures were so beautiful that the congregation's old argument about the stained glass window was entirely replaced by a new argument about whether the nativity set should be kept in the church or displayed in the school, which was at least a more interesting disagreement. The children grew. Clement at 6 was reading everything in the store's book section, and at 8 had declared his intention to be an engineer, which Homer received with the careful seriousness he applied to everything Clement said, and which led to an extended project of building a model bridge from scraps of wood that took up one entire corner of the sitting room for 3 months, and which Birdie navigated around with the patience of a woman who had chosen this life with full information. Ellie at 5 was drawing birds. She had discovered her father's birds on the shelf in the sitting room and had gotten herself a piece of paper and a pencil and set herself to rendering them in a way that was, for a 5-year-old, remarkably attentive to proportion. Homer had seen this, and without saying anything had come and sat beside her and shown her how to look at the curve of a wing the way his grandfather had shown him how to look at the grain of wood. And from that afternoon, Ellie drew birds every day. It was the spring of 1890 when Homer's mother Eleanor came to visit. She had been talking about it for years, and she finally came at the age of 70, making the journey from Missouri by train with the characteristic decisiveness of a woman who had decided something and was not going to be deterred by reasonable concerns about age or distance. She was smaller than Birdie had imagined from the letters and more vigorous, and she spent 3 weeks with them in the rooms above the store and was not in any way a difficult guest, being the kind of person who made herself useful automatically and without announcement. She and Birdie sat together in the evening sometimes when Homer was downstairs in the store working late on the accounts, and Eleanor talked about Homer as a boy, the things that mothers know about their children that the children themselves have forgotten or never had words for. She said he had always been the quiet one, not shy, but interior, a watcher. She said he had cried at age 7 when a wren built a nest in the eave of their barn, and then the nest fell in a storm and he spent an entire afternoon putting it back together piece by piece in the hope the wren would return, which it did not, but he had tried. Birdie thought about this. She said, "Do you know why he started leaving the birds on my doorstep?" Eleanor said. "He wrote to me about it. He said you were the kind of woman who deserved better than awkward conversation in a general store, and that he was not confident he could give you that, and so he gave you the thing he knew how to give." Birdie was quiet for a moment. Eleanor said, "He has been like that his whole life. When he doesn't know how to say the thing, he makes the thing." She looked around the room at the shelf with the birds on it and at the carved bowl on the kitchen table and at the little decorative touches on the chair backs and the window frame, the small accumulations of a man who expressed himself in wood because wood was where his heart lived. She said, "He is very happy here with you. I would like you to know that I can see it very clearly." Birdie said, "I am very happy too." Eleanor patted her hand and said, "Good, that is what mothers need to know." When Eleanor left to go back to Missouri, the children cried, which she received with enormous grandmotherly satisfaction, and Homer held her on the platform for a long moment, and then the train took her away and he stood watching it go with his hat in his hands. Birdie put her arm through his and they stood together until the train was out of sight. He said, "She liked you from the beginning." She said, "I liked her." He said, "She told me once that the most important thing in choosing who to love is choosing someone you actually want to talk to at the end of the day." Birdie considered this. She said, "Your mother is a wise woman." He said, "She is." They walked back through the town together in the spring morning, and it was one of those mornings in Kansas that make you understand why people chose to stay, when the light is golden and the air smells of grass and the sky goes on forever. The 1890s brought the larger world in harder. The financial panic of 1893 reached even Caldwell, and there were difficult months when credit was thin and customers were short, and the store ran closer to the edge than either of them liked. Homer managed the accounts with a calm precision that she was profoundly grateful for, and she managed the buying with the practiced economy of a woman who had been stretching resources since her father's death. They did not go under. Some businesses in town did not survive, and they felt the losses of those neighbors, but the Lawson Haskins store, as people had begun calling it, stayed open through it all. Clement, at 10 during the worst of it, asked his father seriously whether they were going to be all right. Homer looked at his son, who had his mother's directness and his own gray eyes, and said, "Yes, we are going to be careful and we are going to be all right." He said it with the conviction of a man who believed it, and Clement accepted this and went back to whatever engineering project currently occupied the corner of the sitting room. In 1895, Homer did something that he had been considering for several years, and that Birdie had seen coming from at least 2 years before he voiced it. He proposed turning part of the store's expanded space into a workshop and taking proper commissions for woodwork, carved and otherwise. Not furniture, exactly, though he could make furniture. Custom decorative work, the kind of thing that people in a growing town wanted and that there was no other local source for. She said yes before he finished the proposal, and he said, "I haven't explained the financial arrangement yet," and she said, "I know what your work is worth." Yes. He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was trying to contain something large. He said, "How did I manage to marry you?" she said. "You left a meadowlark on my doorstep." He laughed and reached across the counter and took her hand, and she let him hold it while they stood among the shelves of the store that had been her father's and was now theirs and would be, she thought, whoever came after them. The workshop was a modest success that became a genuine one. Word traveled, as word does, and Homer had more commissions than he could comfortably take, which was a problem he solved by being selective rather than by working himself into the ground, because he had learned from watching Birdie that the quality of the work depended on the quality of the attention brought to it, and exhausted attention was not quality attention. He taught Ellie to carve when she was 12. She had been drawing birds for 7 years by then, and her eye was extraordinary, and Homer recognized in her the thing his grandfather had recognized in him, which was the capacity to see the form inside the material. He gave her a small knife and a piece of soft pine and watched her and corrected and demonstrated and watched again. Within a month she had made a bird that made him go very quiet when he picked it up, and he brought it to Birdie and held it out and said nothing. Birdie turned it in her hands. She said, "Oh," he said. "Yes," she said, "she has the gift." He said, "She does." They looked at each other over the small carved bird in the same way they had been looking at each other for 12 years, with the accumulated warmth of all those years, and also with the freshness of a wonder that had not diminished. Clement, to no one's great surprise, proved to have his mother's gift for business and his father's capacity for patient application, and by the time he was 15, he was helping with the store's accounts with a competence that would have embarrassed a man twice his age. He was not a carver and had no interest in becoming one, a fact he stated without apology, and that Homer accepted without disappointment, because Homer understood that the transmission of a gift was not a debt that had to be repaid in the same currency. The spring of 1897 brought a development that nobody in Caldwell had expected, which was the arrival of Eli Lawson, Birdie's brother, coming not for a visit but to stay. He was 43 now and had spent 20 years surveying the territories and had seen enough of the open country to last him, he said, and he wanted to be near family, and was there anything useful he could do. Birdie set him to work in the store with an efficiency that he found both deeply familiar and entirely alarming, because his sister had not changed in 20 years except to become more completely herself. Eli and Homer took to each other immediately, which Birdie had expected. Eli was a man who could read country, and Homer was a man who could read wood, and they shared the fundamental quality of people who look at the world with attention rather than assumption. They went fishing together on Sunday mornings before anyone else was awake, which made Birdie happy in a way she found slightly disproportionate, until she recognized that what she was feeling was relief. The relief of someone who has managed alone and managed well, but has always known something was missing. And what was missing was family gathered around the table in the old complete way. She sat at the kitchen table one Sunday in October of 1897, when the autumn light was coming through the window and laying itself across the shelf where the birds sat, all the original 15 plus several more that Homer had made for her over the years, plus Ellie's first carved bird sitting among them like a graduate, and she counted them without meaning to and got to 23. 23 small cedar and walnut and pine birds in a row on a shelf in a sitting room above a dry goods store in Caldwell, Kansas, and outside the window the town going about its business, and downstairs the store open and doing good trade, and Homer in the workshop at the back with Ellie beside him, their voices coming up through the floor in murmured conversation, and Clement at the kitchen table across from her doing his schoolwork with the methodical thoroughness that made his teachers grateful and occasionally slightly unnerved, and Eli downstairs managing the counter with the comfortable authority of a man who has found his place. She thought about the meadowlark and the October morning 14 years ago when she had almost stepped on it in the gray pre-dawn dark, and she thought about the woman she had been then, capable and self-sufficient, and occupied with her busyness in the way people are when they are keeping something else at bay, and she thought about Homer at 30, getting up before dawn in the bunkhouse of the Rafter T, and sitting somewhere by lamplight with his knife and a piece of cedar and thinking about a woman he barely knew and choosing this particular way of saying what he felt. She thought about him coming through her door the morning of the Cardinal, and the way his eyes had gone to the birds on the windowsill and the expression he had covered, and she thought about riding out to the Rafter T on the hired horse in the October morning and finding him in the yard and saying, "Who made them?" She had known by then, of course. She had known from the moment she saw his hands on the counter. But she had asked because she had wanted to hear him say it, and because the asking and the answering was how you began. Homer came upstairs in the middle of the morning, hands clean of sawdust, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the pot Eli kept on the store's small stove. He came in and set one in front of her and sat down across from Clement, who looked up long enough to nod and went back to his work. Homer looked at Birdie. He said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "The meadowlark." He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, the real full one that she had been the reason for more times than she could count. He said, "The meadowlark." She said, "I have been counting the birds." He said, "How many?" She said, 23, not counting the ones in the workshop. He said, "There are 4 in the workshop in various stages." She said, 27 then. He said, "Give or take." She said, "Homer." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her with the gray eyes that had always been attentive and were now, after 14 years, attentive in a way that had depth behind it, the depth of all the accumulated days and all the conversations at the end of all those days. She said, "I am very glad I asked." He said, "So am I." She said, "That is all." He said, "That is enough." Clement looked up from his schoolwork and regarded his parents with the particular expression of a 15-year-old, who finds his parents embarrassing and is also, beneath that, deeply reassured by them. And then he went back to his arithmetic. Outside the window, the October light was doing what it always did in Kansas, which was to make everything look slightly more significant than it might otherwise. The street and the buildings and the people going about their business all lit with that particular clarity that comes before the cold returns for the year. A meadowlark was singing somewhere nearby, though they were not supposed to be here this late in the season, most of them gone south by now, but this one apparently had not gotten the news, and its song came in through the window and was as clear and specific as a note written in cedar. Homer heard it. She watched him hear it. He tilted his head and looked toward the window and then looked back at her and said nothing, because he did not need to. Ellie's voice floated up from below, calling to Eli about something, and Eli's answer came back in the good-natured rumble of a man who had not expected to be happy and was, and Clement scratched out a wrong figure and erased it and wrote a better one, and the kettle began to murmur on the stove. Homer reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the careful hand that had made 27 birds and a cradle and a bowl and a nativity set, and was currently working on a commission for the new hotel that was going up 2 blocks over, and was also teaching their daughter how to see the form inside the wood. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the meadowlark went on singing, unreasonably, beautifully, as though it had decided that the season could wait a little longer, and that there were still things worth saying before the winter came. The years afterward settled into the well-made shape of a life fully inhabited. Ellie's carved work was sold in the store by the time she was 16, and people came from the outlying farms and sometimes from other towns because they had heard about the work, and Homer beside her in the workshop became not teacher and student but 2 craftspeople alongside each other, each pushing the other in ways neither could push themselves. Clement went to university in the fall of 1898, reading engineering as he had said he would at 10 years old, and they saw him off at the train station with the complex emotion of parents who have done their job and whose proof of it is walking away from them. Homer held Birdie's hand on the platform, and she did not cry, which she had expected to, but she felt the fullness of the moment so completely that tears seemed insufficient to it. Eli stayed and became, with time, indispensable in the way that people are when they find the place where they belong. He married in 1899, a widow named Frances who ran the millinery shop, and who found Eli's surveyor's tales of the territories fascinating and Eli himself more so. And the wedding was smaller than Birdie and Homer's had been but not less warm, and Frances brought her daughter from her first marriage, a quiet girl of 12 named Dora, and the family widened to include them. Homer's mother Eleanor died in the winter of 1899, peacefully at 78 in her house in Missouri, and the news came by telegram and Homer received it with the particular stillness of a man receiving what he has long known was coming, and has not fully prepared himself for regardless. He went to the workshop, and he sat there in the dark and he did not carve. Birdie went down after an hour and sat beside him in the dark without saying anything, and after a long time he said, "She was the best person I have known except for you." Birdie said, "She was extraordinary." He said, "She would have said the same about you." They sat in the dark workshop together until the dark felt less heavy, and then they went upstairs and Birdie made tea, and they talked about Eleanor until late, the way you talk about people you have loved, remembering forward and backward until the shape of the person is fully present in the room one more time. He made a bird for her. A small wren, the same kind as the 15th bird, the last bird he had left on her doorstep, and he put it on the shelf beside the others with Eleanor's name scratched into the base in the same careful letters as the H and L that had been on all the others. He said, "She is in the collection now." Birdie said, "Where she belongs." The first decade of the new century arrived with the slightly disorienting feeling that centuries always bring, the sense that the numbers on the calendar have changed in a way that means something, but you are not entirely sure what. Caldwell had grown and paved its main street, and had a telephone exchange, which Birdie found useful and Homer found alarming in the way that people who communicate through handmade objects sometimes find instant electronic transmission alarming. He adapted because he was practical, and she was not patient with people who refused to adapt to useful things. Clement came home from university with his engineering credentials and a young woman named Harriet, whom he brought to meet his parents with the slightly wound-up energy of a man who is presenting something extremely important and hoping very much it will be received well. Harriet was calm and bright and immediately asked Homer about the carved birds which she had heard about from Clement, and Homer told her the story of the meadowlark in the October morning, and she listened with complete attention and then looked at Clement and said, "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard." And Clement, who had heard the story many times and had the slightly ambivalent relationship with parental romance that adult children generally maintain, said, "Yes, apparently." They married in 1902 and stayed in Caldwell, Clement taking engineering work with the county on the infrastructure projects that were spreading across Kansas as the century settled into itself. And they bought a house 3 streets over, close enough for Sunday suppers and far enough for the appropriate independence. Ellie at 19 was entirely her own person in the way that some people are from early on, not difficult but definite. And she had decided that she wanted to take her carving work to a wider market, and had written letters to shops in Kansas City and St. Louis, and had received encouraging responses. She and Homer had several long conversations about this, and Homer, who had spent his life making the thing you knew how to make and trusting that its value would be recognized, told her to go. Birdie told her to go and to maintain her accounts carefully and to write every week. Ellie went to Kansas City in 1903. She came back for Christmas and for summers and sent excellent letters, and the accounts she sent for her mother's review were in fact carefully maintained. The store that had been Clement Lawson's in 1871, and Birdie Lawson's in 1881, and Lawson Haskins since 1885 went on, with the steady commerce of a place that had earned its community's trust over decades. The book section had grown to take up a full quarter of the floor space. The woodwork workshop had a sign on the door that said Haskins Woodwork, though everyone in Caldwell could have told you it meant Homer and Ellie when she was home, and they were both proud of the sign. On a morning in October of 1905, Birdie came downstairs early while Homer was still asleep, which was unusual because he was always up before her. And she made coffee and stood at the window of the store looking out at the street in the gray pre-dawn light. And she thought about the meadowlark and the October morning 22 years ago, and she smiled to herself in the way people smile when they are alone with a memory that is entirely theirs. She heard his step on the stairs, the familiar weight of him, and then he came into the store in the gray light and stopped when he saw her at the window and said, "You are up early," she said. "I was thinking." He came and stood beside her and looked out at the street, which was the same street and also entirely different from the street it had been in 1883, fuller now and more settled, with its paved road and its telephone wires and its 2 schools and its 3 churches and all the small alterations of 20 years of growth. She said, "Do you know what today is?" He thought about it. He said, "The 8th," she said, "the 8th of October." He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard the smile in his voice when he said, 22 years, she said, "the meadowlark." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him and they stood at the window of the store in the gray October morning watching the day come on. And after a while the light shifted and the street began to show its colors. The brown of the packed earth road and the faded red of the buildings and the blue of the morning sky. And somewhere out in the direction of the creek a bird was singing. He said, "I have something for you," she said, "Homer." He went back upstairs and she heard him in the sitting room, and then he came back down and he had something in his hand, a small carved bird, and he held it out to her in the gray-gold early light, and she took it and looked at it. It was a meadowlark, but not just a meadowlark. It was 2 meadowlarks together, carved from a single piece of cedar, sitting wing to wing on a branch, their beaks both slightly open as though they were both singing at once. The detail was finer than anything she had seen from him before, every feather exact, the 2 birds so natural in their closeness that they looked as though they had always been there and could not imagine being anywhere else. She turned it over. On the base, in the same careful small letters as always, it said not H and L but the full thing, Birdie and Homer, pressed into the cedar as precisely as everything he had ever made. She looked at it for a long time. She felt him beside her, the warmth of him, the 22 years of him. She felt the store around them, her father's store, their store, and the town outside the window, and the children who had grown up in the rooms above and gone out into their own lives, and the birds on the shelf upstairs, 28 of them now counting this one, lined up in the light. She said, "This is the best one." He said, "It had the longest time to become itself." She turned and looked up at him, and he was smiling, the full real smile, with the gray eyes warm and steady and full of everything. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face into it with the naturalness of a man who has been doing this for 22 years and intends to go on. She said, "Good morning, Homer Haskins." He said, "Good morning, Birdie." Outside, the October morning opened fully over Caldwell, Kansas, and the meadowlark kept singing in the direction of the creek. And the light came in through the store window and laid itself across the floor and touched the two small wooden birds in Birdie's hand, the two carved birds sitting wing to wing on their cedar branch. And the town went on, and the store went on, and the years went on, and they went on inside them.